All right, Aaron, introduce us to the podcast. Welcome to the Couch Time Podcast, where we give tools to you parents as you raise your kids. That's what we're talking about.
Be a community.
Yes.
Point students to Jesus and their parents.
Yes. They don't let me do the intro because I'm a boomer and it's like,
shoot, that was a perfect opportunity. Welcome to the Couch Time Podcast, where we give you tools to connect with your students and point them to Jesus. I'm Steven.
I'm Aaron.
And I'm Josh. And last night, we talked about how to love your neighbor and that we're commanded to love our neighbors. So, yeah, you and I, Steven and I taught on the same passage. So it was from Fort Thomas did Mark 12.
Yep.
Independence, and then Florence Middle School, we taught on Luke 10, and then Florence High School taught on Matthew 22.
But all centered around loving your neighbor
that's
as
second
yourself.
part of
how
what
we
is
can do that.
the response to what is the greatest command, which is love the Lord your God with everything that you have, heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then the second part, which is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. So three different passages, same response.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, Aaron, do you want to just kind of give a little bit of a rundown of your lesson, and then we can kind of tag team a little bit of what we taught on?
Yeah. The bottom line of ours was loving your neighbor is not an option; it's a command.
Yeah, that's good.
And at the end of this series, the Love to Love, there's a couple things that I hope the students get, but if it's just one thing, I would hope that it is what it means to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength means you obey Him with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. It says in the book of John, it's like, if you love me, you'll obey me. So we've talked about that verse every week, the last 2 weeks, just kind of as an add-on. It's like, what does loving God look like? It means obeying Him. And so then following that into loving your neighbor, it's like, okay, this is not an option, it's a command. So if we're going to obey this command, that's a way to love God, is to love our neighbors.
Yeah.
And last night specifically, we kind of talked about how if you've got other idols or God is not the only thing in your life that you're loving and seeking after, you're not going to be able to fully love others because you're going to be loving yourself and loving other things. And so that's why it's important to love God solely, which is what fuels our love for other people and our ability to lay ourselves aside to care about others more than ourselves.
That's good.
So it's kind of a what does it look like to love? And we use Pastor Brad's definition of giving to the needs of another without expecting anything in return. And then we talked about you cannot fully do that unless you love God fully, because you won't be able to not be loving yourself.
Yep.
Yeah.
Kind of.
That's great.
And so then next week, it's all kind of teeing up next week, which is going to be those who have been forgiven much, love much.
Yeah.
So it's kind of priming the pump to talk about you can't do this unless you have experienced Christ's love for you.
Yeah.
And you are just resting in Christ's forgiveness and patience and care and love for you. You won't be able to do that for other people. So we talked last night, and I had all the kids come up with, it's like, when I say what does it mean to love somebody, it's like we wrote kissing up on the board and marriage and prince and princesses and Disney movies. Like, there were all these things that came up, and sacrifice and patience and commitment, like all of these things that revolved around love. And it's like, then we talked Brad's definition, and then applied that to our lives, and what does it look like? It's not just a feeling. So kind of talking all over the place, but
That's great.
Yeah.
Steven.
Josh,
Yeah.
will you talk about what we pulled from the Good Samaritan story, and then I'll talk about kind of how I wrapped it up and concluded it after that?
Perfect. Yeah. So essentially, in that Luke 10 passage, Jesus is talking with this teacher, and they're like, hey, so what's the greatest command? Jesus is like, well, how do you read it? And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus is like, yep, now go do it. And then the guy's like, wait a second. Just to be clear, who is my neighbor? So then Jesus tells this parable of the Good Samaritan. And in that story, Samaritans and Jews were like not on the same team. They did not like each other. And so a lot of times when we hear the word Good Samaritan, we're like, oh, that's a good person. But like Samaritans were like not a good people to be associated with. So one, to be able to love your enemies, but there were these three A's that actually Stephen came up with and I used as well, but it was how you love people is through awareness, attitude, and action. So awareness is looking up, looking around you, not ignoring people. That was something we hit on really hard, is like, who are you ignoring? Who are the people that just make you feel awkward or whatever? Having the right attitude. The passage says that when the Samaritan saw the man who was beaten by the robbers, that he had compassion. And you can't have compassion when you don't view people correctly. And then finally, love ultimately motivates action. It's not just seeing people and feeling sorry for them, but it's actually going. And the definition that we used, which is what I stole from Dave Warren, so we're stealing everybody's definitions,
Sorry, man.
is seeking and desiring the very best for someone, regardless of cost or outcome. And in this story, it cost the Samaritan quite a bit, and even to the point where he didn't actually know how much it was going to cost him.
Time,
it was
time and money.
Time,
it wasn't
money,
even just money.
and reputation, because he was helping a Jew. And so all sorts of really awesome things, but love really does look like awareness of people around you, because your neighbor is those who are near you. So awareness, the right attitude, viewing people in the image of God and having compassion on them, and then love ultimately motivates to action.
Yeah, and then how I kind of wrapped it up was going back to the loved to love part of the series. And what I saw and noticed in the passage I hadn't really noticed before is whenever I heard that, I always focused on being the Good Samaritan. But before you can be the Good Samaritan, I told the kids, you first have to be the man that's stripped and beaten on the side of the road, needing saving. And how Jesus ultimately was the perfect example of the Good Samaritan, who, while we were enemies of him, going our own way, wanted nothing to do with him, or Jews wanting nothing to do with Samaritan, saw us in our state, felt love and compassion for us, and then took action to come die on a cross. And at the end of the Good Samaritan story, it says, and when I come back, I will like repay everything.
Yes.
And I was like, and now guys, we're still in this state, if you're the beggar, waiting for him to come back when he'll make all things new. And while we wait for him to come back, we get the privilege to love people like he loved us and to be the Good Samaritan to those around us. So it's like, before you see yourself as the Good Samaritan, first see yourself as the person stripped, beaten on the side of the road that needs saving. And then once you've been saved, start being made aware and have a right attitude and take action towards loving the people around you. So that was cool. The Lord put that on my heart that I hadn't seen really before.
I'm curious, what did you guys say, or who, to answer the question, who's my neighbor? Who are the kids' neighbors?
It's basically everybody who's near them on a regular basis. So whether it's the kids in your class at school, whether it's honestly your parents or your siblings, the kids in the youth group, whoever your kids on your soccer team or whatever, the people you're regularly near is kind of what I said.
Yeah, I didn't go into great detail about it. I think they dug into that some more in groups. But we would just say your neighbors, those people you come across with. The neighbor of the Jew was the Samaritan. It's not that he saw that guy regularly or often or even knew who he was. He was just walking down a road and saw a guy, and that was his neighbor. So I heard someone say once, a neighbor is like anyone you share a room with sometimes. Like it does. It's
that
like
makes sense.
Anytime you're ever around is someone that you are called to love. You may not love them the same way or the same amount of time, it can change.
Yeah.
But at least the idea with the students is like, don't walk blinded to people around you.
Yeah.
Be aware of those around you
Yeah.
and see what they're going
So-
with, just as you see yourself.
I think that was probably in student ministry. I gauge some of the most effective times in my lessons and discussions based on awkwardness and tension in the room. Like if I get to where it's awkward and tense in the room, I feel like I'm making some
Hit
headway.
something.
Like,
Yeah.
And where it got kind of awkward and tense was, it's like, who are your neighbors? And they didn't really answer. It's like, well, everybody is. So they started naming people. It's like, okay, well, who are your neighbors that need loved
Yeah.
and cared for? And they're like, I don't know. And I think what happens naturally for adults and especially for students is they only think about the people who they want to think about,
Right.
who naturally they think about based on what they're getting. So
Yep.
friendships where there's some return, there's some kind of interaction that they enjoy, that they like, they're getting something out of it. And I think it's not always like the Good Samaritan where it's like we're going to find somebody who's beaten up and dying on the side of the
Right.
road. Sometimes we have to be purposefully and intentionally looking around to see who our neighbor is
Yeah.
and finding ways to love them.
Yep.
And what we talked about last night was so attaching this in the book of Mark where it says Jesus answers the question, what is the greatest commandment? He said, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.
Right.
And you shall love him with everything, right? Your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So he attaches loving God fully
Yes.
to the fact that there is only one true God. And then when you're doing that, it's like, okay, then looking next is loving people
Right.
with everything you've got, your
Yep.
neighbor as yourself. And I said, how do people love things? It's like, well, they get to know it.
Mm-hmm.
So, Stephen, you love Spike Ball. How do you get to know Spike Ball? It's like, well, you play it, you watch it, you talk about it. Okay, it's like, hey, shoes. There's kids that love shoes in my group. It's like, how do you know all the different kinds of shoes, different color schemes, the different athletes that
Yep.
wear them, and popular people that wear? It's like you study, like
Yeah.
you're watching, you're interested in it. So if love is not an option and it's a command,
Yeah.
and in order to be able to love people, that means we're going to have to study
Yep.
and observe
Yeah.
and think about and talk about. So it's like, who are people around you? Knowing and answering that question is only going to happen if you start taking steps to study and
sure.
be aware. And that's something that the kids just don't do at all.
Yeah.
So that was a good step where I think kids started to see that it's like, oh, being a Christ follower is going to take. I have to stop living life naturally
For
as I
me.
want to do it,
Yep.
and I'm going to have to start doing things as God says to. And it's like, I
Right.
really don't want to try to love people around me. Like, that
Yeah.
takes work. It's
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah.
It's like, it is. That's
Yeah.
what we got to be about, though.
Yeah.
So,
And it's worth it because it kind of to go along with what you were saying, Stephen, with we have to see ourselves as the beggar. It's like, or the person who got beaten and robbed, like, it's a reflection of Jesus.
Yeah.
Like that he to use our 3 A's, it's like he was aware of our condition, he had compassion on us, and he was moved to action. And that's like the best reason to, because otherwise I'm like, why would I give up things for me?
yeah.
But it has to all come back to having a right view of you and where you've come from. So
Yeah.
what? Yeah.
I was gonna say, so yeah, how can you or can parents
Yeah.
love their neighbors as a family?
Yeah.
Or how can parents take their kids to love people creatively, or talk through the awareness, the attitude, the action? What parts need to change? How can parents demonstrate that and model that with their family better?
I think one of the things is just having regular conversations about who do we need to stop ignoring? Who are the people that? So I gave the example of homeless people. My wife and I love going to Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati, and we just like walk around with our daughter, and it's awesome. It's beautiful. But I told the kids, it's like there's always several homeless people that I pass on the way, and everything in me wants to just like ignore them and to turn my eyes away from them. And so, like, one, for you parents to acknowledge, like, man, these are the people that I want to ignore naturally. And so just having that conversation, I think, is one way to start.
Yeah.
Because if you're not acknowledging who you're ignoring, then you're never going to actually see them.
Yeah, or I think what can happen is you can be aware of people's struggles. Like, you're aware that they're homeless. You're aware that
Yeah,
they're
right.
struggling for food. And then the problem becomes the attitude that follows.
Exactly,
So it's
sure.
like, talk through what's your natural attitude response. I
Yeah.
brought up that it's like, is it judgment? Is
Yeah.
it like looking down? Is it like
Assuming the worst
they
or
got
s-
themselves into that? That's their fault.
Or
Oh,
they-
they're probably this. Oh, they're probably that.
Or they just make you feel awkward for some
Yeah.
reason because you don't know what to do.
So it's like, and then going back to the Samaritan, you have to choose to have compassion. So
Yeah.
it's like, okay, I know these are like the thoughts going through my head. How can I put these off
Yep.
and decide, like, you know what? I'm going to love them because they have a name,
Yeah.
they have a story,
Yeah.
and their story matters to God.
Yeah.
So talk through that. Like, man, how can we love those people?
Yeah.
Or, yeah.
I think another one, if I had to guess, and I don't know how conversations happen with the parents at their dinner table with their kids, but I think one of the biggest enemies to loving people, specifically loving your neighbor, practically, is gossip.
Yeah.
So how do you? So literally, your neighbors. If you
Yep.
live in a neighborhood, or if you don't, and you've got neighbors, it's like, say you get along with them, say you don't. The people that I don't get along with, it's like I'm so tempted to talk with my wife, where my kids can hear in such
Right.
a way. It's like, well, how they parent, or what we witness them doing, or there's this. It's like we really need to be careful, because loving people is not just interacting with them; it's also how we talk about
Yeah.
them when they're not around. And
Because that reveals your heart.
it
how you
reveals
talk
our
about it.
heart.
Yeah.
But specifically with our kids, I think we set them up
Yep.
and how they think about them, and
Yep.
how they're going to talk about them, and how they're going to interact with them, and what's playing on in their mind when they
Yeah.
see them out on the street. Or say it's at school, and one of your children is struggling with another classmate, one of their neighbors, and we let them talk about them in a way that's unhelpful.
Yeah.
That's going to affect their attitude that next day when they see them again, maybe.
Right. Yep.
Versus if you help walk them through what you just said, Stephen, the attitude behind, it's like they're a child of God. Like, they're
Yeah.
created in the image of God. It's like they're not perfect, they're a sinner. Maybe they love Jesus, maybe they don't. It's like, but how can you be a good friend to them?
Yeah.
It's like, you might not be best friends, but it's like, how can you love them? They've got needs. Help
Yeah.
identify those needs.
That's good.
So we need to coach our kids in how to think rightly about other people, whether they're believers, enemies,
Yep.
or whoever.
Yep.
And so I think how we talk about people is extremely huge when it
That's
comes
true.
to practically loving them.
Yeah. Yeah,
So-
because that's another way of planting, watering seeds that
Yeah.
you're always talking
Yeah.
about. Because like it blows my mind sometimes when I know a parent and sort of like how they talk, and then when I hear their kid, it's just like, whoa, you are like, I know exactly where that came from.
Yeah.
good and bad,
Yeah.
and bad. And so it just don't underestimate. I just want to especially highlight
Yeah.
what you were saying. Like, don't underestimate how you talk and what that does to your kid.
Yeah,
so
totally.
that's huge.
And I also want to add what you guys were saying before is, there's so many commands in the Bible. It's like, hey, go and forgive people. It's like, well, how do you do that? Well, it's because you've been forgiven.
For sure.
So
Always
there's
take
so
it
many
back.
opportunities with your kids' parents to highlight what you want your kids to do, and then
Yeah.
attach that to that's because that's what Jesus has done
Yeah.
for
Then
you.
you're having a gospel conversation.
So it's
Yep.
like and even if your kid's a Christian, it's like we need to have gospel conversations. I need to remember that I'm supposed to forgive people because
sure.
I've been forgiven. Like
Yep.
it's something we just have to revisit. So especially when it comes in when talking about other people and loving other people, we do it because of how much God has loved us.
Yeah.
Again, which is what we're going to talk about next week. That's our last lesson in the series at Fort Thomas. I know you guys have a couple more, but
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So parents, I just want to encourage you, like, make use of car rides, make use of dinner time,
Yep.
table conversations, any moment that you have with your student, like, pay attention and use those moments to interact and speak well of other people and speak truth about them.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, parents, look at your campus's social media pages
Yep.
for winter retreat dates and registrations.
Yep.
Whether that's Fort Thomas, Florence, Independence, high school, middle school. There's different things going on for each. So
Right.
talk to the director in charge of your specific ministry to hear about what we have going on in winter. Registration has opened for different campuses, so it's all a little different. So just talk to us, and we can get you hooked up with the right people.
That's great.
I'll pray,
Yeah.
and then we'll close out of here.
Great.
Dear God, thank you for these parents as they're trying to love you and love their kids and disciple their students to the best that they know how. Would you empower them? Would you equip them? Would you give them wisdom through your Spirit? The same Spirit that rose Jesus from the dead is living inside of them if they know you, God. So I know that they have the power needed to do this, Lord. I know some probably feel discouraged or weak, but when they are weak, then they are strong because they're dependent upon you. So help them to remain dependent upon you. And would you help us all to love our neighbor more? Remembering that we have been first loved, and would it just be a natural overflow? Would we be aware of people around us? Would we have an attitude of compassion and love for them? And then would we take action to show our love, just like the Samaritans showed mercy? Thank you for Jesus, who demonstrated all of this in perfect form to save us from our sin. It's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen.